Welcome back to the horse races, everyone. Grab your cash, slap it on the table. Betting is only open until the gates drop. Today's video is the first in this Showdown series, It's a one-on-one, mano-a-mano, closed track race, and let me tell you, this one, folks, it could be a photo finish. Our contest today pits two 40mm f2.5 Sony E mount lenses against each other, the venerable Sony G and the Viltrox. The Sony arrived in March 2021, and the Viltrox is much newer, having been finally released in Sony E at the end of 2024. It was available for some time before that in Nikon Z only. While the Sony does benefit from Sony's own exceptional optical engineering, the Viltrox benefits from a few extra years of design development and, the public availability of the Sony design all that time. To clarify, that is only to say that there are no surprises when it comes to the Sony's engineering and optical formula. For your bottom line up front, the Viltrox on paper looks far more advanced. Stripped of the maker names, I would have pegged the Viltrox design as the Sony design because it has one aspherical element, one extra low dispersion element, and three high refractive index elements. The Sony clocks in with three aspherical elements. The Viltrox also tosses an additional corrective element into the rear of the lens, and it just has a much different optical makeup regarding which of the internal elements appear to be used for the internal focusing. These lenses may be the same spec, and they may share some passing design similarities in terms of the optical design, but they are far from each other in terms of their actual optical design. My prediction going into this, I think that the lenses are going to be functionally the same with some minor nuances in the image results. Now, as I write this, I have not yet reviewed the test photos, and so the prediction that I'm going to give you here is just based on my best guess using these two lenses in real-world shooting. I suspect that there will be some differences in the field of view, the color cast, blurry areas, and overall star performance. The score difference here between these two lenses will likely be minimal because there are only two lenses, so the best possible score could be 10, the worst could be 20. I guess, in theory, that could be how the score comes out. Anyway, even if we had another 5 or 6 40mm f2 lenses in the mix to throw into this, I still think that these two would be in a dead heat with each other. Ultimately, I suspect that the choice of which of these lenses somebody might want to go with will come down simply to the interface, and maybe some minor nuances in terms of the overall optical performance as it relates to things like corner performance and aberrations. Your focal length and angle of view are 40mm and 57 degrees on full frame. The aperture range is 2.5 through 22 for the Sony, up to 16 for the Viltrox. The element and group counts are 9 and 9 and 10 and 6 respectively for the Sony and Viltrox. The design type for the Sony looks kind of sonar-like, and the Viltrox is giving off some double Gauss vibes. The filter sizes are 49 and 52mm respectively. Closest focus on the Sony is 0.25 meters, which is, in my way of thinking, meaningfully better than the Viltrox's 0.34 meters. The native mount for the Sony is E mount. The Viltrox is available both in Sony and Nikon Z as of this video's recording. The dimensions of the lenses and the weight as well are functionally the same. For your performance comparison, the sharpness at closest focus, wide open. The Viltrox here is a hair sharper in the very middle of the images on the plane of sharpest focus, but it takes some serious pixel zooming to ascertain this. The lenses are equally sharp through f4, and then at f5.6, the Sony becomes noticeably better on the plane of sharpest focus. Starting at f8, the Viltrox sharpness falls off at a rapid and noticeable rate. The story changes at infinity focus, though, where the Sony is meaningfully sharper from the starting gate, but then the Viltrox outperforms the Sony starting at f5.6. This likely indicates that the Viltrox is better at transmitting cool color spectra at wider apertures, and that the Sony skews cool as it stops down. The sample shots at the far focus here show mountains that are far enough away for UV scattering to skew the colors in the mountains to be blue, and it does that pretty dramatically. A lens that has a cooler overall image cast will transmit more blue light through it. which means that scenes in the distance will have more apparent UV light scattering softness. To bring this discussion back to the lenses, the Sony is better at infinity focus at f11 and f16 again, which indicates better overall diffraction control. At hyperfocal distance, the story is very interesting. The overall sharpness is roughly identical, but the Viltrox has slightly bluer green tones, which also makes the mountains again appear softer. For this, I'm going to award these lenses a tie and rank them both as 1 because I cannot distinguish which lens took which photo without having my notes in front of me. Their strengths and weaknesses balance out very well, and a winner here, if I were going to pick one in this category, could be decided by a coin toss. Build quality is much better on the Sony, and it takes the top slot here. The lens has controls on it, and the overall feel is much more solid than on the Viltrox. This also, by the way, as a side note, extends to the lens hood. The Sony lens hood is significantly nicer than the Viltrox's is, as we're going to see in the stars test, by the way. In real-world shooting, however, quite interestingly, the Viltrox lens hood does still perform very well. Anyway, we'll get to that. Contrast here will be a tie because both lenses have contrast that, to my eye, is identical. This is shown throughout this video and all of the testing. Star quality goes to the Viltrox because as it stops down, the stars do start to look very nice, and they are much better than the Sony's stars. That said, in real-world use, some attention will need to be paid to the out-of-frame lights, as you can see in the Viltrox samples that a light just beyond the image area is casting a flare onto the photos. And yes, both lenses had their lens hoods on for this test. Distortion was an interesting test. Both lenses appear to have slight barrel distortion on each axis. Stitching the shots together here, it looks insignificantly worse on the Sony. An interesting byproduct of this test, we can see how much different the angle of view with each lens is when they are both focused at the Viltrox's closest focus point. As the test photos showed, however, there was no discernible angle of view difference between these lenses at further focus points. That's just an interesting footnote. Anyway, the Viltrox wins here by the thinnest of margins. Light loss is a peculiar story. Wide open, the Sony illuminates more evenly. Stop down, the Viltrox illuminates more evenly. As we do here, we'll rate based on how much light loss there is across all of the apertures and how long it takes for light loss to disappear in these test photos. In that vein, the Viltrox wins. Flare and ghosting were tested with and without hoods for both lenses. Both lenses exhibited no flare and inconsequential ghosting for real-world use. The Sony exhibited faint ghosts, both with and without the hood, and there were a few of them visible in the video and test shots. The Viltrox exhibited a singular and nearly invisible ghost with the hood, but none without, which is honestly really fascinating, and I could not figure out why that was. Anyway, the Viltrox wins here, and I honestly expected the Sony to walk away with this category easily because the Viltrox flared during the stars test, and the Sony has a significantly better lens hood. The Zeidel analysis shows a remarkable difference in these lenses. It's hard to see from far out, so let's zoom way into the image centers. The Sony is significantly sharper than the Viltrox. The lines on the Sony sample have far clearer definition, with the monitor's texture being visible in the images. The corners show differences which are hard to see from afar, so we'll go into 100% here again, and now we can see that the differences between these lenses are strong. The Viltrox shows tangential astigmatism blur in the diagonal line, some chromatic aberration in the radial astigmatism test line, and the dots have become flies due to coma mixed with the tangential astigmatism that we saw in that diagonal line. From a technical perspective, the Sony here is substantially better than the Viltrox. Looking at the fairy lights with the lenses at infinity focus, both lenses exhibit strong aspherical element onion rings. The Viltrox, however, also reveals that even wide open, the aperture is never fully open, as the aperture blades are visible in the shape of the light blurs. At close focus, the performance is similar, with the Sony delivering larger blurs due to its closer focus point, but far stronger onion rings, likely due to the fact that it has 3 aspherical elements and the Viltrox only has 1. The Viltrox retains a bit of the aperture shape in the close focus blurs, but the onion rings are far less pronounced. The Viltrox also shows some overcorrected spherical aberration at close focus, which is apparent in the bright perimeters of the blurry dots. Overall, this is a close contest with each lens displaying strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to give the win here to Sony, though, because the dots test chart performance was incredible. And the blurry lights test is a bit more subjective because what it does is it provides a way of looking at the blurry area character that a lens delivers, and also to identify some limited mechanical design issues like mechanical vignetting, or in this case, the aperture being visible throughout the entire aperture range, even wide open. Ultimately, the blurry lights test is less important than the dots test because the results of the blurry lights test are more to do with image aesthetics and personal look preferences than they are with technical testing. Now, handling is again going to be somewhat subjective. I like more controls, so I'm going to give the point here for this to the Sony for the on-lens aperture ring, manual focus, autofocus control switch, and the on-lens button that I can customize the function of through my camera's menu. Also, I always forget this, but there is a switch on the Sony to disconnect the aperture detents for smooth aperture ring motion. The Viltrox has fly-by-wire focusing like the Sony, and the Viltrox does have a nice and easy ring to grab because it is very large. The Sony has a much thinner ring, and I do find when I go to manually focus the Sony, I often grab the aperture ring before the manual focus ring, and that's kind of annoying. Fans of a simpler lens interface may prefer the Viltrox for use here. Fans of having more controls on the lens will like the Sony more. Using golf scoring, the Viltrox ekes out the slimmest of wins here owing to star quality distortion and light loss. But it lost in the categories that I think are the most important, those being handling, aberrations, and build quality. But what this result tells us is that a lens that is new, around US dollars 140 as of early 2025, can hold its own and frankly in many ways outperform the Sony G of the same spec. The Sony lens cost me more than US dollars 500 in 2023 when I bought it new. So for the price difference, the Viltrox is the clear winner here, with the Sony's price premium being something that would be worth the added cost only for a very few users. Those users who would want to look at the Sony instead would be videographers, high-end photographers who plan to use the whole image area and for whom the quality across the entire image area is paramount, and those photographers who are highly concerned with the handling and interface of a lens. Now, I won't lie, I do fall into that latter category, but were I in the market to buy one of these two lenses brand new, I don't know that I could justify the added cost of the Sony just for the interface elements it provides and the relatively minor improvement in technical performance.